In Pella, capital city of the Kingdom of Macedonia, 356 BC, King Philip II and his wife Olympias welcomed their son. A descendant of the gods, the boy was destined for greatness. He grew into a fearsome warrior, a ruthless military leader, a conqueror whose name would live on for thousands of years as one of the greatest military commanders the world has ever seen. In the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, Macedonia had become the dominant power of the ancient Greek world. At age 16, Alexander was left in charge of Macedonia, as his father, King Philip, marched against Byzantium. In 340 BC, the young prince was set to encounter his first taste of military leadership. With Philip absent, the Thracian Mede tribe took the opportunity to rise up in revolution against Macedonia. Alexander rushed to meet the challenge, driving the rebellious faction out of the territory and founding his first of many cities, naming it after himself. By 338 BC, Philip's gradual conquest of Greece was well underway. Seeing the grave danger, Athens and Thebes rose up in an alliance to fight off their aspiring invaders. Philip and Alexander marched from Macedonia, past Thermopylae, through Boeotia, until they met the defending Greek army at the plains near Chaeronea. The armies were close in size, equally determined to decisively defeat the enemy line before them. On the left, Alexander led the cavalry, facing the army from Thebes. The Athenians attacked first, and Philip retreated back from their advance, slowly drawing the enemy into a trap. When at last the time came to charge, Philip and the Macedonian army broke through the Athenian line, crushing the defenders and sending them fleeing in desperation. On the left, Alexander took his chance. In a legendary show of courage, he led the charge to encircle the elite core of the Theban army, piercing through the gap in the enemy line, heading directly for the sacred band. The renowned 300-strong force fought to the last man, until Alexander was able to overwhelm and finally annihilate them. Alexander had proven himself once more. Philip had extinguished all opposition from mainland Greece, finally achieving the domination he had worked tirelessly towards for decades. However, Philip II, King of Macedonia, would not have long to bask in the glory of his successes. In 336 BC, Pausanias, his own bodyguard, stabbed him between the ribs. The king fell to the ground, dead. So it came to be, Alexander succeeded Philip to the Kingdom of Macedonia, crowned Alexander III at the age of 20. But with this, he inherited the enemies on all sides, eager to exploit any signs of weakness in their young new ruler. Taking no time to settle into his newfound powers, Alexander set his might to consolidating his position, all whilst looking longingly to the east, towards the vast Persian Empire. Alexander inherited his father's fantasy, a united Greece campaigning east to avenge years of oppression from the Persian Empire. The League of Corinth was a coalition of Greek states united in this goal, formed and led by Philip. When he died, leadership of the alliance was passed down to Alexander. Before he could fulfill this dream and set out east, he had to put down the revolts erupting all over his empire in the wake of Philip's assassination. Alexander moved swiftly, marching across the coast from Amphipolis, crossing the river Nestos and invading Thrace. A rebellious band had arisen in the region, styling themselves the Free Thracians. On a narrow pass leading across Mount Haemus, he found his way barred by the rebels that had fortified the high ground. The Free Thracians had built a barricade of wagons to defend against the advance of the Macedonian phalanx, and when Alexander began his climb of the mountain, they rolled these wagons down the steep slopes to crash into the Macedonian line. Unfortunately, there was a flaw in their battle strategy. The Macedonian soldiers, in a display of brilliance unforeseen by the enemy, sidestepped the speeding wagons. Where the path was too narrow, the shield bearers knelt, creating makeshift ramps, sending the wagons hurtling harmlessly over their heads. With their plan falling flat, the Free Thracians were no match for Alexander's hoplites. They dispersed, fleeing down the mountain. Alexander turned his attention to the Tribaloi tribe, but this wouldn't prove so easy. They were aware that the Macedonian army was coming, and sent the women and children of their tribe to an island on the river Danube, safe from Alexander's warpath. With their backs to the river and Alexander approaching, the army was snared. Alexander decided it would be best to draw his enemy away from the river, so he sent his archers to rain arrows down on their position. As the archers came within range, the Tribaloi were forced to attack, charging out at the unarmoured bowmen. But on open ground, the Tribaloi were no match for the elite Macedonian cavalry. The cavalry crashed into the right flank, then pierced through the centre. Unable to contend with the might of this mounted onslaught, the tribe were forced back into the river and scattered into the surrounding woodland. Having routed their army, Alexander left the Tribaloi stranded on their island and decided to cross the Danube, where the Getae had gathered to block his crossing. His army were ferried across in local fishing boats, slipping by in the dead of night undetected by the enemy. He flanked behind them, and when the sun rose revealing his miraculous appearance on their side of the river, The Getae were terrified. Forsaking their mission to stop the Macedonian advance, as well as their feebly fortified city, they gathered as much as they could carry and fled into the wilderness. No one could stand in Alexander's way. Ambassadors began flooding in, eager to appease the new king. However, north of Macedonia, the Illyrian tribes did not share this sense of self-preservation. Getting word of an uprising in the region, Alexander had to act quickly. He sent the loyal Agrianians north on a mission to plunder Illyria, whilst Alexander himself went to deal with the rebels who were fortified at Pelion. When he learned that the Thracians, a powerful Illyrian people, were yet to join their force to the main host at Pelion, Alexander decided the best course of action was to seal them in the city, building strong walls to trap them in, rather than risk being surrounded in an all-out assault. However, just one day into the siege, the Thracians arrived. Alexander was forced to give up hope of quickly capturing Pelion. Instead, a foraging party was sent out to restock the Macedonian supplies, as they prepared for a prolonged siege. The Thracians heard that a weak force had broken away from the Macedonian army, and seized the opportunity, encircling the party and closing in. Alexander, refusing to lose good men without a fight, led the relief force himself, riding to the aid of his trapped soldiers before night fell, and they were slaughtered. The rescue team pushed back the Thracians, and the foraging party were reunited with the main force. Despite this small victory, Alexander was in a precarious position. He couldn't attack either of the strong armies without making himself vulnerable to a rear assault. He had no choice but to retreat across the river. The Illyrians, eager not to let this opportunity pass them by, charged after the Macedonians as they withdrew. The Macedonian archers and siege engines bombarded the rear guard as they waited to get across, desperately trying to shield from an Illyrian assault. Under this relentless storm of arrows and rocks, the Illyrians had no choice but to let the Macedonians flee. But unknown to the rebels, Alexander didn't go far. He waited for the guard to drop when the Illyrians were certain he was safely escaping back to Macedonia. In the night, he led a small force into the enemy camp, striking before the sleeping soldiers knew what had hit them. The Illyrian army was disbanded. Unable to regroup, the soldiers threw away their weapons and armor to disappear into the mountains. But every time one uprising was extinguished, another rose to take its place. This time the threat appeared in Greece. In Thebes, exiles had taken control of the city, claiming that Alexander was defeated by the Illyrians and was dead. They insisted on this lie until Alexander regrouped, marched down through Boeotia, and appeared at their city gates. Alexander had been forced to act fast and without forgiveness. If the spark of rebellion began to spread to Sparta, Athens, and across all of Greece, the League of Corinth would vanish, his invasion plans would fall through, and he risked the collapse of his whole empire. Alexander camped outside the city gates. Inside, there were still some loyal to the Macedonian king, trapped in the city. The two sides entered a standoff. Alexander was trying to negotiate peace, whilst the revolutionary leaders desperately tried to maintain control and draw Greek allies into the uprising. Finally, the tension boiled over. Two Macedonian battalions ignored Alexander's orders and attacked the city walls. Alexander couldn't risk two lone units being lost in the battle. He sent another 2 legions to reinforce them, but again the Theban army drove them back. In the heat of the battle, the fighting became disorganized and chaotic. Alexander sent the phalanx in to exploit the confusion. They drove the Thebans back, pushing through the city gates. The Macedonian loyalists trapped in the city were freed and joined the fighting. What followed was a complete massacre. Alexander and his Macedonian army were eager to send a message to the other Greek cities. Resistance would not be tolerated. Thebes, once one of the most powerful cities in all of Greece, was destroyed, its citizens dead or enslaved, and lands distributed amongst the cities that had stayed loyal. Alexander had secured complete control of his empire. There were no rebellions left to face, no powers that would dare risk fighting and facing the same fate as Thebes. Now the time had come for preparations to begin. Alexander was ready to make his mark on history, to fulfill his father's dream. Not even the might of the great Persian Empire was going to stand in his way.